It's 1918. The Ottoman Empire and its Central Power allies have been defeated. Now, one would assume that the peoples of the Middle East would be given their own nations and everyone would live happily ever after. But you would be wrong, because you boys, France and Britain decided to do what colonial powers do best, and that is to draw some straight lines through random stretches of the deserts and towns of the Middle East and call it a day. While Turkey was able to avoid its ungodly partition by the Allies, the lands more distant from the former capital of Constantinople didn't get that lucky, with Syria going to the French, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Armenia being taken by the Soviets, and the lands of Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq going to Britain. The years from 1919 to 1940 in Iraq were extremely convoluted and tumultuous times, filled with coups and unrest that would have me going on for hours, but this video is more dedicated to Iraq's involvement during World War II. Iraq had been put in a strange situation after the Iraqi Revolt of 1920, being signed over not as a colony per se, but as a British protectorate. This allowed for the Iraqis to have a limited self-rule and provided the government with the rights to build and maintain private government establishments. This included the ability to construct an Iraqi army, with many of their officers being sent to Germany for training during the 30s. The Iraqi independence movement was mostly a wash, with the nation basically being put in a state of de facto RAF military control. During this time, multiple British air bases were constructed along with newly discovered oil fields and their subsequent drilling and refining facilities being placed under complete control by the British government. Iraq didn't immediately expect to enter the war on the Axis side in 1939, and if you look at the government policies at the time, it's blatantly clear that their pro-British government did not want to be on bad terms with their British overlords, and by 1939, the Iraqi government had severed diplomatic ties with Germany and expelled all German officers from Iraqi soil. But in 1940, Iraq's pro-German officer corps and its army backed a coup to overthrow the British-backed regent Prince Abdul-Allah and instead install the pro-independence Rashid Ali Gailani as prime minister. Right off the bat, al-Gailani showed his anti-British sentiment by keeping diplomatic ties with Italy when they declared war in June, along with sending diplomats to Germany. Due to the close proximity of Britons in the Iraqi government, word spread fast about al-Gailani's moves towards war. The build-up and open fighting was very slow and unorganized, with small amounts of British forces being diverted from India and Australia to Basra over the next year or so, along with the buildup of colonial Arab troops massing on the Iraqi Transjordan border. At a glance, it's hard to see what Gailani and his generals were thinking. Not only had they decided to openly voice their support for the Axis without any regard for the British who had bases and offensive military forces in the area, but they had also not taken any initiative when it came to planning offensive or defensive actions. Most officials in the Iraqi government thought that the British would simply turn and run and pull all of their influence out of the area, even though the nation was being surrounded from all sides by the very forces they believed would turn around at first word of an Iraqi declaration of war. When open hostilities began on May 2nd, 1941, the Iraqi army definitely had the advantage in the Middle Eastern theater, fielding around 60,000 Iraqi army regulars, 2 motorized infantry brigades, an armored company consisting of 16 Italian-built L3 tankettes, and possibly a few Italian L3 light tanks, along with 1 armored car brigade of British manufacture. The Iraqi Air Force actually proved to be the strongest offensive asset in the beginning, with around 60 to 80 serviceable bombers and fighters of British and Italian manufacture, including Gloster Gladiators, Breda 16 fighter bombers, and Savoia SM-79 medium bombers. Most of the Royal Iraqi Army and Air Forces were based out of Baghdad, though, nowhere near to borders, with exceptions of a few forts on major highways to Baghdad. The opening British forces within Iraq were quite small. Ground forces included No. 1 Armored Car Company RAF and 6 companies of colonial troops, about 2,000 men strong. Under the command of Air Vice Marshal Harry Smart, the Armored Car Company had around 18 ancient Rolls-Royce armored cars of World War I vintage, and the entirety of the British garrison forces within the country were based out of RAF Habana, which was the largest British air force within Iraq, situated miles from the Iraqi capital. This base was probably the biggest threat to Baghdad at the start of the war. and the men within it would find themselves quickly besieged by Iraqi land and air forces, unable to service many of the fighters and bombers after initial raids by Iraqi forces. Iraq did field a minor navy, but it put up no resistance to the British, especially because the British forces had already landed in Iraq before the declaration of war. Once the first shots rang out around RAF Habana, Churchill gave the order to commence an all-out attack, stating, "If you have to strike, strike hard. Use all necessary force." With this blank check, British commanders in the area commenced general offensives, launching fighters and light bombers from HMS Hermes in the Persian Gulf, along with medium and heavy bombers based out of Transjordan and Egypt. It didn't help the anti-British sentiment at all when bombs began raining over Iraqi villages and cities, most of which were positioned near strategic forts and oases. And after the Grand Mufti of Baghdad declared jihad against the British Empire, full-scale mobilization of the Iraqi army began on May 2nd. Later that very day, things started really going to crap for the Iraqis, leading to some absolutely mind-boggling realizations of the Iraqi army. You see, while the Iraqis sieging Habana carried live ammunition and were firing on the airbase, many of the soldiers were under the impression that they were on a training exercise with the besieged British, since war had not been declared yet and no one had informed them of it. Rashid Ali and members of his government were also shocked by the fact that the British defenders of the airbase were prepared to fight rather than to negotiate a peaceful surrender. To compound the surprise and shock, many members of the Muslim Iraqi army were preparing for morning prayers when the attacks from the airbase were launched. On May the 3rd, British bombing of the Iraqis continued. Troop and gun positions outside Habana were targeted, as well as the supply line to Baghdad. The Royal Iraqi Air Force bases in Baghdad, Rashid, and Mosul were also attacked, with fierce air sorties breaking out as desperate Iraqi interceptors attempted to shoot down well-defended British bombers. The aircraft base on HMS Hermes also proved especially helpful since its air complement was able to secure large swaths of air superiority in southern Iraq. The largest problem for Iraqi forces was the terrain of the very nation they had to defend. You see, Iraq pretty much sits on a flat patch of land in the Middle East, with not easily distinguished chokeholds or defendable positions. The order of battle almost always played out the same, with British forces coming upon a defended city or a fortress along a highway just to use the flat, featureless terrain to circumnavigate the Iraqi positions and push on, while rearguard forces besieged the enemy garrison. The British fighter supremacy didn't help either, as Iraqi efforts to retreat were also thwarted. As of the 6th of May, the Iraqis besieging Habana began to pull out. By the dawn of Wednesday the 7th, RAF armored cars reached the forward Iraqi positions and reported it all to be deserted. Due to the strafing by British fighters, columns of Iraqi forces would find themselves sitting ducks as convoys of trucks and light tanks had nowhere to run. Out of the large Iraqi army besieging Habana, 6 howitzers along with 2,400 shells, 1 tank, 10 Crosley armored cars, 79 trucks, 3 20mm anti-aircraft guns with 250,000 shells, 56 machine guns, and 340 rifles, along with 500,000 rounds of ammunition, were left abandoned and subsequently used by the British against the Iraqis. Also around May the 6th, the Luftwaffe ordered Colonel Junk to take a small force to Iraq and operate out of Mosul. This force would be known as Fliegerführer Iraq, and between the 10th and 15th of May, the aircraft arrived in Mosul via Vichy French air bases in Syria. They then commenced regular attacks on British forces. In the end, Junk's unit consisted of around 21 to 29 bombers and a few fighters. The Germans also flew in a small Brandenburgers commando group to provide protection to Axis air bases around Mosul, but they didn't see any service against British forces. Even with the Axis support, the walls began to close in on Iraq, though, as British general offensives began to advance from the west and the south towards Baghdad. The Iraqi army was able to reinvigorate their forces after the loss at Habana, when Vichy French equipment began flowing in from Syria via rail. The Iraqis took millions of rounds of ammunition, along with hundreds of thousands of rifles and machine guns. Help was coming too late, since the only Axis route into Iraq was by air. British commanders began marshalling more and more fighter aircraft to pinpoint Axis aerial convoys, along with hunting down Fliegerführer Iraq, which represented the most elite Axis forces deployed in the Middle East. As the desperate fight for Iraq waged on, the climax would occur on the 17th of May during the Battle of Fallujah. The city of Fallujah represented the pinnacle of Axis defense of Iraq, as its large cityscape, rocky terrain, and adjacent river finally provided the Iraqis with defendable territory, and its proximity to Baghdad allowed reinforcements to arrive after British attacks. During the nights of the 17th to 18th of May, elements of a Gurkha battalion, a company of RAF Assyrian levies, and armored cars approached Fallujah from the west. During the early hours of the day, one company of the 1st Battalion King's Own Rifles were air transported in and landed right on the Baghdad highway to the east of Fallujah, securing the bridge across the Euphrates River. Throughout the day, the RAF bombed positions of the town along the Baghdad road, avoiding a general bombardment of the town because of the civilian population. On May 19th, 57 aircraft began bombarding Iraqi positions within and around Fallujah. First, leaflets were dropped in an attempt to get the Iraqis to surrender and evacuate, but after receiving no response, they said screw it and proceeded to drop 10 tons of bombs on Fallujah in 134 air sorties. Street-to-street fighting ensued throughout the week, and on the 22nd of May, the Iraqi 6th Infantry Brigade conducted a counterattack against British forces within Fallujah. The Iraqi counterattack started around 2 in the morning and was the largest offensive the Iraqis mustered since the initial siege of Habana, comprising of about 6,000 infantry supported by the 1st Tank Company. Once the Iraqis had pushed into the city, desperate and confused fighting began everywhere, as newly arriving Iraqi tanks and infantry scattered throughout the streets, and along with the besieged Iraqi garrison clashed with the British forces as the Luftwaffe strafed overhead, trying to defeat British positions outside the city. Though Fallujah represented the peak of Iraqi defense, the Iraqi and German attack was chaotic at best, with the Germans failing to scramble sufficient numbers of aircraft to the battle, especially since the British didn't have any fighters operating in the area. And on the land side, the Iraqi strategy fell apart when the army entered the city, with individual tanks and split squads of infantry running amok throughout the city, only to be picked off by British snipers or blown away by hidden machine guns and anti-tank rifles. If there had been more cohesion of combined multinational arms, then the Axis could have probably forced the minimal British forward army to retreat, extending the fight long enough to get more Axis support into Iraq, as Italian bombers and transport planes were just starting to enter Baghdad and Mosul, just to be sent packing once they heard the British forces would soon be overwhelming the very cities they were landing in. Fliegerführer Iraq would soon deem the situation untenable after receiving almost 100% losses in 1 month and began withdrawing immediately from Iraq. Minor fighting occurred after Fallujah, but it was only a matter of days before the British were marching on Baghdad, and with that, Rashid Ali's government began collapsing. Again, fate had been against the Iraqis, for most of their heavy equipment and a 20,000-man-strong army was ready to defend Baghdad against the meager force of 1,600 British men, who had assumed Iraq had no more forces left to defend the city. If Rashid Ali and his generals had known this, they could have probably mustered the will of their men to push the British leagues farther back and possibly even rescued the nation as pro-independence rebels began springing up to take up arms against the British. All in all, I see Iraq as a nation who really had no reason to enter World War II, and as another nation whose nationalist leaders had led their countrymen astray. Even with all the blaring warnings and obvious signs by the British, they still believed the Axis was their only way to gain freedom, and at what cost? 1,750 soldiers and innocent civilians who found themselves displaced by the war and were subject to even more oppressive military occupations for the next few years of World War II. Thank you for watching. If you would want to see more content from me, please consider subscribing, liking, and/or commenting on the video on what you enjoyed about it. See you again soon.